What a powerful story. I hope Reverend Moss's story really inspires you to think about how to build community differently. And so we'll move now to our next discussion, faith as a motivator to move from preaching to practice. And it's going to be in two parts. First, we'll speak with faith leaders who are working directly with faith communities to support them and ensure that they have the tools and resources to help build community, personal and spiritual grounding, and resilience in the face of climate change, to pursue and advocate for equitable solutions that dismantle systemic injustices, and three, to work towards a just transition from fossil fuels for communities currently reliant on them. And so I want to welcome our first set of panelists. I'm joined by Nana Firman, Senior Ambassador with GreenFaith and advisor with the Islamic Society of North America's Green Initiative. With more than 2 decades of experience working on sustainability, Nana is a leading voice in interfaith environment and climate action, both in the US and internationally. We have Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, founder and CEO of Dayenu, a new organization mobilizing the American Jewish community to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. I love that. And the Reverend Melanie Mullen, the Episcopal Church's Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care, working with individuals, with congregations, and dioceses to pursue and practice loving formation, liberating advocacy, and life-giving conversation and relationships with all of creation. Each of our panelists will share some brief remarks. We'll start with Nana in a moment, then Jennie, then Melanie, and then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. So welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here. So why don't we have, Nana, why don't you go ahead and start first, maybe share a little bit about your work to move people with faith to bolder action.
Well, thank you, first of all, ecoAmerica, for inviting me to this important summit. And first, I greet you all with the Islamic tradition greeting of peace, Assalamu alaikum. And as we know, climate change is undeniably a spiritual, moral, and ethical issue. Therefore, it's crucial that faith play a significant role in climate justice movement, with the power to transform consciousness and shape values, carry out rituals, and also motivate communities to take actions. In fact, climate crisis presents a severe ethical challenge, forcing us to confront difficult questions as individual moral agents, and even more so as members of larger religious institution and political system. And it is genuinely global and intergenerational. So a greening of faith includes a vision of integrating human society into the ecosystem of our planet. And today, many of houses of worship are no longer just preaching about global warming, but also taking action by greening their own facilities, like greening the mosques, the churches, temples, and so on. And they've also begun to greening their own religious practices and holiday celebration in response to climate crisis. So obviously, congregation also and house of worship can be a safe harbor in case of severe disasters and extreme weather events. However, after decades of knowing how serious this problem is, we are still seeing the massive gap in policy and in financial commitments between what is needed to address the climate crisis and what the governments and financial institutions are actually doing. And this gap is morally inexcusable. So we see still fossil fuel exploration and development continuing to grow, and tropical deforestation advancing every second. And the lives of indigenous peoples and environmental defenders are routinely at stake, and especially when they have the moral courage to speak up and to stand up for it, what is right. And on the other hand, grassroots religious communities are seeing themselves and their families, friends, and neighbors impacted directly by climate change. And this become apocalypse around the globe almost every day. And it's always those who have done the least to contribute to the problem that get hurt the most, like the ethnic minorities, the poor, people with disabilities, elders, and young children and women. And this climate change has been a long issue, and historian even giving an increasingly serious look. And in the past 15 years, religious communities' primary focus has been on education and awareness raising, and teaching our faiths and central values of our relationship with the sacred and the planet. But this education, although it's vital, is not enough. We have seen the magnitude of the crisis, and we know that public action at scale is absolutely essential. And this is how difficult moral issue like that we face right now is being addressed. So that's why, like last month, diverse religious and spiritual communities in 49 countries carried out over 400 actions to draw attention to the climate crisis. The Global Day of Action is called Sacred People, Sacred Earth, organized by a grassroots global multi-faith alliance of GreenFaith International Network. And it sparked a year-long push toward the UN climate negotiation this November in Glasgow. The action were united behind 10 moral demands, such as an immediate end to new fossil fuel infrastructure, and to stop tropical deforestation and exploitative agriculture, and to end the bank financing those industries, but instead funding 100% renewable energy, especially for the 800 million people who still lack of electricity, and the transition to net zero emission in wealthy countries by 2030 and accelerate globally by 2050. And also offer a warm welcome for refugees and migrants who are forced to leave their homes because of the climate disasters that they did nothing to create. And so these demands prioritize the urgency of the climate crisis and the steps which we must take to solve it. And while it's also provide a clear and accessible framework to create a just and sustainable future. And transitioning to a zero carbon economy and building resilience community requires strategic planning and careful management to protect the most vulnerable and to avoid stranding people and communities. So a just transition takes courage to change, courage to create a generative economy, courage to promote justice, and courage to live in solidarity and joy among humanity. And no religion sanctions the destruction of the planet. But this is exactly what we are doing at the moment. Our religious and spiritual beliefs compel us to respond. To change everything, it takes everyone. Together, we can make the change, and the time to act is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's such a powerful testimony, and what a testimony with all of those events that happened on March 11th around the globe. It was incredible to see and so inspiring. And I would encourage our audience today, who's made up of both people of faith and people outside of the faith tradition, to check it out and to learn more about the incredible work that was done and continues to be done. Jennie, do you want to share a little bit about Dayenu's work?
Sure. I first want to start by saying amen, amen, amen to everything that Nana just shared. Such a profound and concise articulation of what is needed. So glad to be having this conversation today about the role that faith plays as a motivator. I have the privilege of leading Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. And as Annie shared, we are a multi-generational Jewish movement that's working in partnership with other communities to confront the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. And that is not only because they are both needed, but those two things are interconnected. Faith is such an important motivator, I believe, in taking people from talking about climate, being concerned about climate, to acting on climate solutions, and in shaping those solutions, and in sustaining people in the work for the long haul. So faith communities, I think, bring, as Nana was sharing, a really important moral voice, centering values like human dignity and social justice. Faith also reminds people that a different future is possible and holds out a vision for what that future could look like. Faith communities are, of course, a base of community organizing and leveraging power and raising up voices, collective power to political leaders. But as importantly, Faith, I think, is what can ground people not only in urgency, but also in community and possibility and hope. There's power in spiritually rooted activism. So for Dayenu, we bring Jewish history and experience and teaching and tradition and faith and song to the movement, that it's not just a series of tactics, but a movement that is rooted in community and spirit. So our Torah and history as a people are among the things that sustain us, empower us, give us courage. For Jews, those are stories like the Midrash of Nachshon walking into the water up to his nose before the seas would part, needing to have moral courage, the midwives risking their lives to birth babies, the many times throughout history when we and many peoples have faced annihilation, but instead not only survived, but re-envisioned and rebuilt a different future. We know that the majority of Americans are concerned about the climate crisis. We also know that most are not taking meaningful action at the scale that justice and science demand, the kind of actions that Nana was talking about. And I think that's for two reasons. I mean, it's for many reasons. I think it's for two major reasons. One is that people don't know what to do to make a real difference in the face of such a complex problem. And the other is that it's so emotionally overwhelming to confront the truth of climate destruction. It's like too much for our souls to bear, and we turn away. So our work is to address both of these things. First, to provide meaningful pathways to take strategic action and build collective power. So one of the ways we do that is by organizing Dayenu circles around the country, small groups that are coming together to take climate action with a Jewish voice and doing it in partnership with other communities, the kind of days of action that you were just hearing about. Right now, we're celebrating our first birthday this week, Dayenu, and we have about 80 Dayenu circles across the country in 27 different states. And we work to ensure that the work and the partnerships are centering justice, because we know that the impacts of the climate crisis rest disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized, right? People living in the global South in poverty, in particularly vulnerable areas, people who've experienced racism and other kinds of bigotry. It's a force multiplier, right? It exacerbates historical inequities, even as it impacts everyone. And as such, climate justice has to be central to our analysis of the problem, to the solutions that we're working for, and how we get there. This means, of course, our policies need to have big investments in frontline communities and a just transition. But it also has to shape who we listen to, what partnerships and coalitions we join, and where we are taking our lead from. So let's quickly turn to the second reason that I think a lot of folks are not taking action, which is this, how unbearable it is to imagine our futures and the future for our children, let alone our grandchildren, if we are not able to avert the worst of climate disaster. So the other pillar of Dayenu's work, and this is true in many faith communities, we're calling spiritual adaptation, supporting people and communities to confront the existential, emotional, psychological, for some people, religious issues that are raised by the climate crisis. How do we enable people to grapple with what it means to live and lead and teach and parent and come of age in this time? So this spring, we're piloting a new workshop called Confronting the Climate Crisis and Cultivating Spiritual Courage in 10 communities around the country. It's based in and grows out of Joanna Macy's work that reconnects, but grounding it in Jewish tradition and practice, because we need to give people the space to face the truth and all the grief and anxiety that brings, and to move towards courageous action. We need to be doing this both for its own sake, because it's part of what it means to be human beings and living lives of meaning. And we believe it's part of base building. It's part of how we actually build collective power in this moment. So faith calls us with both urgency and possibility. I think of it as sort of in both hands, both are true. And in this spirit, I'll just close with a word about why we call this movement Dayenu. Dayenu is a joyous song of gratitude that we sing each year at the Passover Seder, when we retell the story of the Jewish people's journey from slavery to freedom. And it recounts all the things that God's done for us. We say, if God had taken us out of Egypt and not given us the Torah, Dayenu, it would have been enough. But it also means we've had enough. We've had enough destruction. We've had enough valuing fossil fuel companies over human life. We've had enough of letting the impacts of climate destruction fall disproportionately on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Dayenu. But it's also a double entendre, because it can also mean we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the resources, we have the policy rubrics, we have the technology, we have the people, we have the power. We have what we need so that everyone can have enough. This is urgent and sacred work, and it's going to take all of us.
Amen, amen, amen. I've just been sitting here saying that over and over again to both what Nana and Jennie are sharing, and Dayenu now. Melanie, I would love for you to share a little bit about what you're doing with the Episcopal Church.
I have to reiterate and repeat those amens. And it is truly life-giving and affirming to know that people of all faiths are feeling the need to be active and be on one accord for this urgent climate crisis. One of the things that I feel we're drawn to, especially in our Episcopal Church, is critical reframing. And ecoAmerica really helped us do that a few years ago with just pointing out where we are and where we are in alignment and where we stand with that simple survey about where people of faith feel called to and how they understand the crisis. And it became a point of surprise and encouragement for us to realize that, number one, we're not alone, that people of faith, people in civil society, people across America care very deeply about the well-being of the earth and all citizens therein, despite the fact that we might hear a narrative that says otherwise. And so that reframing motivated us and it's impassioning us and it fired us up to realize that some of our work, number one, is about changing that narrative, that we're not the lone outsiders or outcasts, that all across America caring about the impacts of climate change and eco-justice are unifying. And we are leaning into that place where faith can start and convene a conversation across Black, white, left, right, blue, red, that the church and the Episcopal Church especially can stand in a place where we know that there's some common ground for everyone to come together and talk about what we all hold so dear. We were so surprised, and we hear it again and again, that our neighbors across the fence or across an aisle also care very deeply about the well-being of our earth. And the second piece that we're leaning into is owning the place where our moral narrative encourages us to make sure that when we say justice, when we say righteousness, when we say we're living into our biblical mandate, our moral and communal mandate, we include all those who are left behind, the least, the last, and equipping ourselves to understand that when we talk about people and communities that will be most impacted by the changes in our environment and our climate, we're talking about frontline communities. We're talking about places where people don't have resources. We're talking about people and communities that are still living with these states of oppression, be it racial, environmental, states of economic inequality. And so for the Episcopal Church, that means educating ourselves about what climate equality can be, what reparations for the climate, and what equality can be amongst all the ways we do pursue that work. So it could go from the Sunday school teacher who acknowledges that caring for the earth is also caring for everyone in it, all the way to those who want to do activism and advocacy on the state and national, local level. And I read again what Jennie and Nana said. We're teaching ourselves that doing community and local work is also really important to being inspired to do the climate work, and that we don't want to get overwhelmed. And so encouraging our grant giving process, encouraging networks of folks who are working on local gardening, ecology projects, partnering with HBCUs, that all of those ways locally that they can understand the impact of climate on their environment are ways that they can have an impact on the world. We have been thrilled to and privileged to, as an Episcopal Church, to be in halls of power. We have folks who go to the Capitol Hill. We have folks who go to the COP gatherings and talk to national leaders. And what they have told us is that It's what local communities, church communities are doing. It might be really innovative, or it might be something very typical, like putting solar panels on their roofs. But those are the ways in which local and average Americans are doing the work of some mitigating for climate change and working on ways that we can do some adaptation together. And so it's part of our work as church to lift that up and to say you don't have to be at the center of power, you don't have to be really rich, but whoever you are and wherever you are, with your intent to live in a just world and not leave any of those least able to deal with the effects of climate change behind, is the first start for us. And as we've looked at this terrible year of COVID and crisis, we see the symmetry. We see the ways that our struggle for climate equality is intersectional. It's woven together. We understand now more than ever that when there are communities that are saying we can't breathe, that we can look at that from a lot of different angles. And church folks are doing that and thinking about what does it mean for folks who are parishes and communities in places of poor air quality, or parishes where we joke that the St. Simons by the sea might become the St. Simons in the sea. What does it mean for some of those communities that face more problems than others? And how can we as a whole community help bring attention, resources, and activism for that work? And so that's been a really great and motivating place for us to keep hope going, to keep inspiration going, and help people build community and work together. And just reminding folks again and again that the tools that they have to build their churches and to build their community in a lot of different ways are the same tools that they will use to work on lobbying their state legislator. Perhaps they're fighting a pipeline, perhaps they are writing letters to their congressperson, but they're using the same tools to reiterate that the ways we don't want to leave anyone behind go for the ways in which we want to make sure that the government and our community realizes that the folks who really need attention and care, and the whole community as a whole responding to climate change are the people that we want to make sure that we're in solidarity with at all times and in all places. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I hope that people listening are hearing just how well supported you are in doing this work, whether it's your own faith tradition, interfaith organizations like GreenFaith, and others. I mean, I'm sure all of you would welcome partnership with anyone listening today. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but I wanted to ask all of you really, what do you hope to see in the policies and legislation that's moving through Congress? I mean, especially as we consider the COVID recovery and the advancing infrastructure proposals that implement climate solutions and ensure, I think you've all talked about economic, racial, gender justice, and a just transition. So what are you hoping to see? Maybe I could have Rabbi Rosenn start.
Sure. So this past year, we've faced, these intersecting crises, a public health emergency, growing economic insecurity, systemic racism, the rise of white nationalism, and all of this is happening against the backdrop of worsening climate. But just as the causes are connected, so are the solutions. And this is where we have been given this opportunity in a very problematic way, but an opportunity nonetheless to have a just green recovery, to address these interlocking issues together. So we're now in this moment as a nation of moving from COVID relief to economic recovery. And we really have a once in a generation opportunity to transform our society and our economy, not to rebuild the same unjust and polluting infrastructure. So President Biden recently released, as I'm sure folks are well aware, his American Jobs Plan, massive infrastructure and jobs proposal to rebuild America by rapidly transitioning to a clean energy economy without leaving anyone behind. And that piece is really important. And his vision is impressive in its ambition and scope. And yet, I would say it does not go quite far enough to meet the urgency that science and justice demand. And even his plan is going to be challenging to get through Congress. So I think that there really it comes down to three things: clean energy. How do we really achieve truly transformational energy? We're going to have to build big, bold investments in clean energy infrastructure and technology, setting up bold targets for transitioning away from fossil fuel. 2, creating good jobs and supporting and protecting workers we're going to build a more just economy, we have to pay workers fairly and protect their rights and provide training and employment opportunities and support those who want to enter or remain in the workforce. And 3, uphold environmental justice, right? Environmental justice is a person's right, regardless of race, income, zip code, to a safe environment to live and learn and work and play and pray. So to realize environmental justice, we have to address the historic wrongs and ensure that everyone has a say and can benefit from the new clean energy economy of the future. So I would say this is a moment. It's hard to overstate, I think, the potential of this moment for us to really be talking with our representatives, talking to our members of Congress, letting them know how critical this moment is, how big an investment we need, and how much this is our best shot in a generation at transforming our society.
Nana, I'm curious with your work. I mean, what can people do right now to support this kind of federal action? I know there are ways that they can get involved with your work, but I'd love to hear some examples.
So thank you, Reverend Jennie. Rabbi Jennie, I wanted to just continue from that. Even though we want that, and we need to remind also the people need to call on Congress that they need to take bold commitments, especially increasing the reduction of the carbon emissions from the United States. United States needs to take a leadership on this climate negotiation because United States just returned back to the Paris Agreement, and we applaud President Biden for hosting the summit just last week with 40 global leaders. And we need United States to take this leadership not only to reduce the carbon emission, but also to end the new fossil fuel development, and also to end the financial investment on those industries, because we cannot just going through the clean energy investment, but then not stopping this fossil fuel development. So those people need to be involved on that. They have state representatives, and also within their own congregation, they can start doing that. As I mentioned about greening their house of worship, but just that is not enough, because we need personal transformation, but we also need institutional change, that we all belong to religious institution, that we need the change also within those religious institution, and only that we can go together and hand in hand to change the system, and then hopefully we can change this before it's too late, as mentioned by the 2 speakers before me.
Well, thank you so much. And the call to action here, I hope, is being heard loud and clear. We don't have a ton of time. So what we're going to do, we have some questions that have come in, and we will post those after the summit and work with our speakers to write a blog answering a lot of your questions. But I wanted to get to one last one, which I think is just so important. What do you do to ground yourselves in this work and to stay resilient in the face of, I think, just the magnitude of climate change and the injustice that's at its root? Is there something you do and something you might recommend to the audience? Reverend Melanie, you want to start?
Oh, I would love to. The thing that I do personally is also the thing that we want to encourage communities of faith to keep doing communally, and that's grounding ourselves in the story. There is power in making change by just lifting up the stories, be it noticing what my neighbor is going through, or calling up a prayer partner and friend in a community that and asking them, what is life like for us and what can we both be thankful for, but also what are you struggling with and struggling against? And that's how I know that my neighbors in the Black Belt parishes are still working with getting adequate sewage and plumbing, or my neighbors in the West Virginia churches are still working on getting adequate solar and job access. And so being a true ally brings me peace and brings me power. And I hope if I can share stories of resiliency with one another, we can actually achieve change.
Anna or Jennie?
To build on that, I think remembering and acting in community. We're not in this alone. We're not in this alone as individuals or as families or even as faith traditions. And finding ways to connect in all different ways, small and big, with others, and bringing our collective voices and our collective stories and our collective vision.
Nana, how about you?
Yeah, well, for me as a Muslim, I'm obligated by my faith also and my shared humanity to stand up and fight for this climate justice and for all people suffering from the effect of climate change, wherever, whenever, and however I can. And due to the magnitude of this crisis and the injustice that we see, I think like it is very important that we must avoid burnout. So having regular meditation, reflection, reconnection with those working on this movement together, and of course, more importantly, is self-care. Always have self-care. So then we are, like we take also like compassion to our own self. So that's very important because we need a long way to go, and we need all the energy that we can have to get to that path.
Oh, thank you so very much. This has been a really rich and wonderful conversation, and I just hope that our audience is taking that away as well. So thank you for your passion, your commitment. I want to just encourage, my colleague has been chatting out how you can get involved with each one of the different efforts of our panelists today. So make sure you're checking out those links in the Action Center and think about ways you might partner with them, support and replicate their efforts in your own communities. But next, we will hear from our sponsors, and my colleague will lead us in a stretch break. And then we'll come back for round 2 of this discussion to talk about how we can expand faith engagement and activate more people to climate action and advocacy. So stay tuned, and thanks again, everyone.